The kingdom of Eldrath had known war for longer than most could remember. Smoke often rose from distant villages, and the sound of marching soldiers was a constant drum in the hearts of the people. Yet in the midst of this chaos, some names struck fear deeper than any battle horn. One such name was Cale, the War Duke. Ruthless, cunning, and unyielding, Cale had carved his path through kingdoms like a blade through silk. No fortress could hold him, no army could defeat him, and no oath could bind him, except, perhaps, the one he had set his sights upon now. Ilara, the daughter of Earl Valon, was known for her beauty and her sharp mind. Her hair, dark as midnight, fell in waves over her shoulders, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and piercing, yet full of emotion. She had been promised to another, a noble alliance meant to strengthen her father's position in the fragile peace of Eldrath. Yet even the strongest vows were fragile when a storm like Cale arrived. The War Duke rode into the Earl's estate with a quiet, measured confidence. The horse's hooves struck the stone courtyard with echoes that seemed to warn of danger. Guards snapped to attention, unsure whether to fear him or obey him, for Cale had the reputation of someone who could inspire both terror and obedience in a single glance. The Duke dismounted, his black cloak flowing behind him like a shadow, and his gaze immediately found her, Ilara, standing at the edge of the courtyard, hesitant and tense. "Duke Cale," her father said formally, bowing with the practiced courtesy of a noble. "It is an unexpected honor." Cale inclined his head slightly, though his attention never left Ilara. "I do not come for honor, Earl," he said, his voice low, smooth, and controlled. "I come for negotiation." Yet there was a hunger in his gaze, an intensity that made even seasoned nobles shift uncomfortably. Ilara felt a chill run down her spine, though the day was warm. She had heard tales of Cale's battles, of entire armies scattered before his command, and of lords who had disappeared in the night after offending him. And now, he was here, standing so close that she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the faint scar across his cheek, the dark eyes that seemed to measure everything, including her, with unsettling precision. Over the next days, Cale remained in the Earl's estate, ostensibly for negotiations. Yet his presence was suffocating. Every conversation, every movement, seemed designed to unsettle the household. Ilara could not deny that she was both frightened and strangely drawn to him. In his presence, the air seemed charged, as though the world itself held its breath. One evening, Cale requested a walk in the gardens, claiming that fresh air helped clear the mind. Ilara's father hesitated, but eventually allowed her to accompany him, thinking a gentle stroll could demonstrate civility. The garden was vast, with tall hedges and ancient statues, and the moon hung low, silver and serene, casting pale light across the paths. Cale walked beside her silently at first, his boots crunching over the gravel. Then, without warning, he spoke. "You do not belong in a life chosen for you," he said quietly, his voice carrying both curiosity and accusation. "I see it in your eyes. You are not meant to be bound by another man's ambition." Ilara stopped, startled. How could this stranger, this dangerous man, see so clearly into her soul? "And who are you to judge?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I am Cale," he said simply, "and I see truths that others fear to speak." She wanted to turn away, to retreat behind the walls of duty and decorum, but something in his gaze held her still. It was not only the danger she sensed, it was the raw intensity, the sense that he had known loneliness and loss in ways no one else could imagine. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion. A group of mercenaries, cloaked and armed, attempted to storm the estate under cover of night, targeting the Earl. Chaos erupted, guards shouted, steel clashed, and the moon seemed to tremble in the sky above. Without hesitation, Kale drew his sword, moving with a grace that was both terrifying and beautiful. Ilara watched, frozen, as the man who had unsettled her with a mere glance became a whirlwind of deadly precision. He protected her instinctively, placing himself between her and the attackers. She had never seen courage displayed so fully, so completely. Every strike was controlled, every movement calculated, and yet there was a strange poetry to his violence. When the last mercenary fell, Kale stood over them, chest heaving, eyes dark with adrenaline. He glanced at Ilara, who could barely meet his gaze. For a moment, the world fell silent between them, filled only with the echo of their shared fear and relief. "You are safe," Kyle said finally, his voice softer now, though still commanding. "For tonight." Ilara wanted to speak, to express gratitude or fear, but words failed her. Instead, she simply nodded, aware that something profound had shifted. Kale, the man who was ruthless as war itself, had revealed a fragment of himself to her, his willingness to protect, his recognition of her worth. The following days were marked by tension. Kale lingered at the estate under the guise of diplomacy, but every interaction with Ilara seemed charged with unspoken meaning. He would watch her from across halls, catch her gaze in fleeting moments, and speak in ways that tested the boundaries between propriety and confession. Ilara felt a strange pull she could neither understand nor deny. She knew her duty was to her family, to her betrothed, to the world that had arranged her future. Yet Kale's presence challenged everything she thought she knew about loyalty, fear, and desire. One night, as she wandered the quiet halls of the estate, she found a small envelope lying upon a windowsill. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular and deliberate. Her heart beat fast as she opened it. Inside was a single note. "You are not as the world wishes you to be. Neither am I. Meet me where the moon touches the highest tower, and you will see the truth." Ilara shivered. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to hide from the dangerous allure of the man who had already claimed her attention without consent. Yet another part of her, perhaps the part that longed for freedom and adventure, could not resist. That night she found herself at the highest tower, the wind whipping her hair around her face. Shadows stretched long across the stone battlements, and the moon hung like a silent sentinel. Kyle was there, leaning against the railing, his cloak billowing, the darkness of his presence softened only by the silver light. "You came," he said, voice almost a whisper, but it carried through the wind. I wanted to know," she admitted, her voice trembling. Kale's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, a glimpse of something almost human breaking through the ruthless mask. "To know what?" "To know the truth of you," she replied, the confession barely more than a breath. Kale stepped closer, the scent of leather and smoke surrounding him. "And if you knew, would it frighten you? Or would it change you?" Ilara met his gaze, feeling an unfamiliar tremor in her chest. The world she had known, of duty, promises, and safety, felt suddenly small, fragile, inadequate. She wanted to step back, to flee, yet her feet remained rooted, and her heart betrayed her with an answering flutter. The wind howled around them, as if the night itself had taken a breath, waiting. And in that moment, under the silver eye of the moon, they were not duke and noblewoman, not predator and prey. They were simply two souls drawn together in the storm of fate. Kale's eyes darkened again, the hunger returning, tempered now by something deeper, almost reverent. "I will have you," he said, low and certain, "but not as the world expects. You will choose, or the world will choose for you, and neither of us may survive that." Ilara felt a shiver pass through her, equal parts fear and longing. She knew this was the beginning of a journey she could not yet understand. A journey that would challenge every belief she had, every law and promise she had ever respected. And yet, she could not turn away. Above them, the moon hung bright and steady, as if marking the start of a new chapter in both their lives. Shadows moved in the corners of the estate, and the distant howl of a wolf carried across the hills, chilling and beautiful, a reminder that destiny often comes clothed in danger. Ilara's heart raced, and Kyle's presence filled her senses. In that silent, moonlit moment, the world held its breath with them, waiting, watching, and whispering promises that would change everything. The War Duke had made his goal clear, and the Earl's daughter, though promised to another, had already felt the stirrings of a storm she could no longer resist. The morning after the moonlit encounter, Ilara could hardly breathe without thinking of Kale. Her room felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in with the weight of expectation and duty. Her betrothed, Lord Halric, was a good man by all accounts, loyal, respectful, and dutiful. But Kale's presence haunted her thoughts. He was a storm in human form, dangerous and dark, yet there was something in his gaze that stirred a longing she could not name. The day began with the usual bustle of a noble household. Servants hurried through the halls, attending to duties that seemed trivial to someone whose heart was no longer quiet. Ilara moved mechanically, answering her father's questions, smiling politely at visiting lords, and hiding the flutter of anticipation and fear that had taken root within her. Kale, meanwhile, appeared at breakfast as if he had been there all along, his dark cloak sweeping behind him as he entered the hall. Conversations fell silent, and the servants' whispers rose like a tide. The War Duke's reputation was enough to silence any gathering, but today it seemed he had an even greater effect. "Good morning, Duke Kale," Ilara said, keeping her voice steady though her pulse quickened. She avoided his gaze, feeling the strange pull of both fear and fascination. Kyle's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Good morning, Lady Ilara," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of unspoken meaning. "I trust the night did not trouble you?" She shook her head. "No, though sleep often feels distant when the world is so heavy." She caught herself, realizing she had spoken more honestly than she intended. Kyle's eyes, dark and measuring, softened for the briefest moment. Later that day, as Ilara walked through the estate's private library, she found herself thinking of the note Kale had left her. His words echoed in her mind. "You are not as the world wishes you to be. Neither am I." The phrase seemed to follow her, wrapping around her thoughts like a shadow that was impossible to ignore. Kale appeared without warning, stepping from between the tall shelves. "I hoped I might find you here," he said, his voice low, intimate. "This place suits you. Quiet, full of secrets, much like you." Ilara's heart raced. "You speak in riddles," she said softly, though there was a strange thrill in hearing him speak so freely. "What is it you want from me, Kale? My obedience? My fear?" "I want none of those things," he replied, taking a step closer. "I want your understanding. Your trust, perhaps, though I do not expect it easily. There is much in my life you cannot yet see, yet it will affect you all the same." The weight of his words pressed against her chest. She wanted to retreat, to return to the safety of her father's orders and her promised marriage. Yet something in Kale's presence, a truth behind the harshness, drew her forward. "And if I cannot trust you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Then you must trust yourself," he said, his gaze unwavering. "For soon choices will come that cannot be avoided. The world will demand your loyalty, and hearts will be tested." The tension between them was palpable, a thread of energy that seemed to hum in the air. Ilara realized with a start that fear and attraction were no longer separate in her mind. They were intertwined, binding her in ways she could not yet name. That evening, the estate was thrown into chaos. A messenger arrived, breathless and terrified, bearing news of a plot against the Earl. Rival nobles, resentful of his power, had hired mercenaries to force a political advantage. The estate's walls, usually secure and serene, suddenly felt like a fragile barrier against the storm outside. Kyle moved with quiet precision, directing the guards, checking gates, and ensuring that Elara was safe. His presence was commanding, and yet he seemed attuned to her needs, positioning himself so that she was always protected without ever feeling caged. When the mercenaries struck, it was not a battle of armies but a test of skill, patience, and courage. Kale fought with the deadly efficiency he was known for, yet every movement seemed measured, never careless, always mindful of Elara's safety. She watched from a balcony, fear and admiration battling within her. He was both terrifying and magnificent, a figure of power and intensity that seemed to blur the lines between man and legend. After the attack was repelled, Kale found Elara in the gardens, the moonlight soft on her face. He approached her quietly, the chaos of the night falling away like water from a stone. "You should not be out here," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, only concern. "I needed air," she admitted. "The night was too loud, too full of fear." He reached for her hand, but stopped short, not touching, merely hovering close. The gesture, small and restrained, carried more meaning than any words. "Fear is natural," he said softly, "but do not let it bind you. You are stronger than they know. Stronger than you believe." Elara's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in his words, yet the shadow of her duty loomed over her like a storm cloud. "And you?" she asked. "Are you bound by your own shadows, Duke Kale?" He looked away briefly as though wrestling with the ghosts of his past. "I am," he admitted, "and yet I have learned that shadows do not define us. Choice does, and perhaps in that we can find freedom." A moment passed, heavy with unspoken emotions. Elara felt a strange warmth, a spark of courage she had never known. She understood, in a way she could not yet explain, that Kale's ruthlessness was not the whole of him. Beneath it lay a man capable of loyalty, of care, of depth she had not imagined possible. Suddenly, a loud clamor rang from the hallways. The Earl's guards rushed past, tense and hurried. Kale's posture stiffened instantly, every muscle alert. He glanced at Elara, his eyes darkening. "Trouble finds us even in calm," he said. The next hours were filled with careful planning. Kale discovered that the rival nobles had sent spies within the estate, aiming to destabilize the Earl through fear and deceit. Elara, despite her initial hesitation, insisted on helping. She provided insight into the household's routines, knowledge that proved invaluable. Kyle watched her closely, impressed by her intelligence and courage. Through the night, they moved together through shadowed halls and moonlit gardens, their connection deepening. Words were sparse, but the unspoken understanding between them grew with each shared glance, each small act of trust. Elara began to see Kale not just as a conqueror, but as a man burdened by past choices and haunted by a darkness he struggled to master. Finally, as dawn approached, they found a quiet terrace overlooking the estate. The first light of morning painted the sky in soft golds and pinks, and for a moment, the world seemed still, as if holding its breath. "You have changed the course of tonight," Kyle said, his voice low and sincere. "Not just by your actions, but by showing courage. It is a rare gift, one that many never possess." Elara turned to him, her heart full of a mixture of awe and fear. "And yet," she whispered, "we are still trapped by the world that surrounds us. My betrothal, your reputation. Our choices are not entirely our own. Kyle stepped closer, the wind tossing his cloak, the first rays of sun catching the dark metal of his armor. Perhaps not entirely, he admitted. But every choice we make, every act of defiance or courage, shapes the path ahead, and I would risk all to see you safe and free. Ilara's breath caught. The intensity of his gaze, the sincerity in his words, stirred something deep within her. She wanted to trust him fully, to lean into the strange, dangerous pull that bound them together. Yet a part of her still feared the consequences. Before either could speak further, a shadow moved across the terrace, an unmistakable signal that danger had not ended. Kyle's expression hardened, the predator returning. "They watch us," he said, his tone sharp. "And soon, their next move will not be so easily stopped." Ilara felt her stomach tighten. The night's events, the moonlit encounter, the shared danger, it had all led to this moment. She understood, with a clarity both frightening and exhilarating, that her life was no longer solely her own, and Cale, the man both feared and desired, was now inextricably linked to her fate. He offered his hand, not as a conqueror, but as a guide through the storm that threatened them both. "Come," he said quietly. "The world is harsh, and the path ahead is uncertain. But we face it together, or we fall alone." Ilara hesitated for only a heartbeat, then placed her hand in his. The warmth of his touch was steadying, grounding her in a way she had never experienced. And as the first sunlight broke across the estate, she realized that this was only the beginning, of danger, of desire, and of a bond that neither time nor duty could easily sever. The War Duke had made his intentions clear, and the Earl's daughter had stepped into a world that would test her courage, her heart, and her very soul. The storm of fate had begun, and there was no turning back. The morning after the chaos at the estate, a heavy silence hung over the halls. The events of the previous night had left every servant, guard, and noble shaken, yet the weight of fear pressed most heavily on Ilara. She moved through her chambers as if in a dream, the memory of Cale's unwavering gaze and steady hand following her like a shadow. Her heart had been captured not by force but by the depth of his presence, by the strange combination of danger and trust he had offered her. Cale, however, was not free of his own burdens. The victory against the mercenaries had been costly, not in lives, but in whispers. A shadow from his past stirred, reminding him that the Dukes of Eldrath carried not only power, but a curse as old as the mountains themselves. Generations of his family had been bound to war and fear, their hearts hardened, their destinies shaped by forces beyond their control. Cale had always believed he could master it, that he could remain above it. But in Ilara, he saw something that challenged the very nature of that curse. A spark of humanity, of hope, of love that could either redeem him or destroy him. Ilara found Cale waiting in the gardens that evening, the same moonlight that had first drawn them together casting silver over the statues and hedges. He was quiet, contemplative, watching the stars as if seeking guidance from the distant heavens. "You look haunted," she said softly, approaching him with careful steps. Kyle turned, and for a moment, the mask of ruthlessness slipped. "Perhaps I am," he admitted. "The world I carry is heavy, Ilara. Some truths are not meant to be easily borne. And yet, you make it lighter, even if you cannot know it." Ilara's chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. "Kyle, I do not understand. You speak of burdens and curses, and yet you protect me as if I am worth everything." He stepped closer, the air between them charged with quiet intensity. "You are worth more than I have ever known. That is why the path ahead is dangerous. Not all will accept what is growing between us. Not all will allow freedom of heart." Her mind raced. She knew he was speaking of more than the political machinations around them. She had begun to see, in fleeting moments, the man behind the Duke, the one shaped by loss, haunted by the choices he had made, yet yearning for something he had long thought impossible. Love. "Kyle," she whispered, "what is this curse you speak of? Why does it haunt you so?" He hesitated, as if the words themselves were chains he feared to release. Finally, he spoke. "My family, for generations, the Dukes of Eldrath have been bound to a destiny of conquest and war. It is not merely reputation. It is a shadow that follows us, shaping our choices, feeding on our ruthlessness. I have fought it all my life, and yet it lingers. Always." Elara reached out, her hand trembling slightly. "And yet, you choose to fight it, even now?" Cale's gaze softened as he took her hand in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "Yes," he said quietly, "because for the first time, I have seen something worth more than victory, worth more than fear. I have seen you." A shiver ran through her, not of cold, but of realization. The man who had seemed untouchable, ruthless, and unyielding was capable of change. He was capable of hope. And in that, Elara found both courage and terror. Courage, because she sensed that she could trust him. Terror, because the forces that bound him, and now touched her, were greater than either of them. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. A messenger appeared, breathless, eyes wide with urgency. "My lord! Lady Elara, a spy has been discovered within the estate. They carry information, secrets that could endanger both your lives." Kyle's expression darkened instantly, the predator returning. "Where?" he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "In the northern tower," the messenger replied, trembling. "He was seen leaving with documents." Kyle did not hesitate. He turned to Elara. "Stay here," he ordered, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "Do not leave this garden until I return." Elara shook her head. "I will not be left behind. If danger comes, I will not hide." Kyle studied her, a mixture of admiration and warning in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Then stay close. Trust my lead and do exactly as I say." They moved swiftly through the shadowed halls, the air thick with tension. Kyle's knowledge of the estate allowed them to avoid the guards, moving like shadows themselves. At the northern tower, they found the spy attempting to flee, documents clutched tightly in his hands. With a single, precise strike, Kyle disarmed him, the spy collapsing to the floor with a defeated groan. Elara watched, heart pounding, as Kale retrieved the documents. His movements were calm, controlled, yet there was a raw energy to him, a reminder that he was a man who could command life and death with a single decision. "You see why I am dangerous," he said quietly, turning to her with a half-smile. "Not because I wish harm, but because the world itself demands ruthlessness. And yet, I would choose mercy for you, always." Elara's eyes filled with emotion. "Kale, She stopped, unsure how to articulate the whirlwind of fear, admiration, and longing that had taken root in her heart. He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her like a shadowed flame. "Do not speak," he said softly. "Words are not enough. Actions. Trust. That is what will carry us through the trials ahead." They returned to the gardens in silence, the weight of the night settling over them. Elara realized that she had crossed a threshold. She could no longer deny her feelings, her fascination, or her desire to understand the man beneath the Duke's armor. And Kale, in turn, felt the first stirrings of something he had long thought impossible. A chance at redemption, at a life not dictated solely by power and war. But even in this fragile moment of connection, the world around them was shifting. Rumors of political betrayal, whispered alliances, and hidden enemies began to surface. The spy they had captured was only a fragment of a larger plan, a plan that threatened to ensnare them both, to force Cale into a choice between his heart and his duty, and to push Elara into a life she might not survive without courage and wit. The following days were a delicate dance. Kyle trained the guards, uncovered plots, and moved silently through the halls like a shadow of justice. Elara studied the spy's documents, discovering clues about the rival noble's intentions and the dangers that lay ahead. Together they became a force, their bond strengthened by shared purpose and the unspoken acknowledgement of what had begun between them. One evening, after a long day of preparation, Cale led Elara to the highest tower, the same place where they had first truly seen one another under the moonlight. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of the earth and distant forests. Kyle turned to her, his expression unreadable but intense. "The world will not wait for us," he said quietly, "nor will it forgive weakness. But I have seen your strength, Elara. I have seen your courage, and I will not allow it to be wasted." Elara's throat tightened. "Cale, I want to believe you. I want to trust that whatever comes, we can face it together. But how can I be certain?" Cale reached for her hand again, their fingers brushing in a moment of gentle contact. "Certainty is a luxury the world rarely grants. All we can do is choose, to act, to fight, to stand for what we know is right. And in that choice, we find freedom." The wind carried his words, and Elara felt them sink into her very being. She understood, finally, that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer merely a daughter, a noblewoman, a pawn in political games. She was part of a force greater than herself, bound to a man who had once been a storm, now tempered by hope, courage, and perhaps love. Yet even as they stood there, hand in hand, a shadow fell across the tower wall, a distant figure moving swiftly through the estate, unseen but watching. Cale's eyes narrowed. "We are not alone," he murmured, his voice a low growl of warning. Elara's pulse quickened. "Then the danger is not over?" Cale shook his head, a grim determination settling over his features. "No, not even close. But together we may yet survive what comes, and perhaps we may triumph." The first light of dawn broke across the horizon, painting the sky in soft gold and violet. The world seemed calm, yet the undercurrent of danger pulsed beneath its surface. Elara and Kyle stood together, the bond between them strengthened by the trials they had faced, and by the unspoken promise that whatever shadows awaited, they would confront them as one. And somewhere in the distant hills, the echo of a wolf's howl carried across the land, a reminder that destiny often arrives cloaked in darkness, and that even the fiercest hearts may find redemption through courage, trust, and love. The sun rose over Eldrath, casting gold and amber light across the castle walls. Yet the warmth of morning could not erase the chill that lingered in the halls. The whispers of plots and the shadows of rival nobles had grown louder, more urgent. Cale and Elara knew that the final trials had come. The time for hesitation, for quiet observation, had ended. Destiny demanded action, and the path ahead would test them in ways they had not yet imagined. Cale stood in the great hall, reviewing the maps and documents that outlined the web of betrayal threatening the Earl's estate. Each line, each mark, spoke of danger, of hidden enemies, and of the forces that had been gathering for months. He had fought many battles in his life, yet this one was different. It was not only a battle of steel and strategy, but of hearts and choices. The curse of his lineage, the shadow that had followed the dukes for generations, weighed heavily upon him. If he failed, it would consume him, and anyone who dared to stand beside him. Elara entered quietly, her presence a calm amid the storm. "Kyle," she said softly, What must we do? How can we face what is coming? He looked at her, his eyes dark yet tender. We face it together, he said simply. Not just with swords, but with trust and courage. There is a way to end the curse that binds my family, but it will require a choice neither of us can take lightly. Ilara's heart pounded. A choice? What must we do? Kyle hesitated, then spoke with the weight of truth. The curse is ancient, bound to the blood of the dukes. To break it, I must offer something I value more than life itself, something that proves my willingness to change, to surrender the ruthlessness that has defined my family. And you must be willing to believe in me, even when the world seems against us. Ilara took his hand without hesitation. I trust you, Kale. I will stand with you. Whatever comes, we face it together. A faint smile touched his lips. For a moment, the Duke seemed less like a conqueror and more like a man, vulnerable, human, and capable of love. Then we begin, he said, and together they moved to the highest tower, where the wind and moonlight had first drawn them together. The tower was quiet, yet charged with tension. Kyle drew an ancient blade from its sheath, the steel gleaming with an almost supernatural light. This weapon, he said, is tied to the curse. It has been passed down through generations, carrying both the power and the burden of my family. Tonight, we decide its fate and mine. Ilara watched, awe and fear mingling in her chest. And what must I do? Be with me, Kale replied, his voice steady. Stay close. Trust in what we have built. And when the moment comes, act as your heart tells you. As night fell, the castle came alive with shadows. Rival nobles had discovered their plans, and their forces moved to intervene. Kyle and Ilara, united, prepared for what would be the ultimate test of courage, loyalty, and love. Guards and allies rallied around them, their loyalty strengthened by Kale's reputation and Ilara's insight. Yet the danger was clear. Failure was not an option. The battle began with sudden, violent chaos. Figures moved through the halls, striking with steel and cunning. Kyle fought with the precision and skill he was known for, yet now his movements were tempered with purpose beyond victory. Every strike, every decision, was measured to protect Ilara, the estate, and the fragile chance at freedom and redemption that they both shared. Ilara stayed close, guiding allies, uncovering secret passages, and using her knowledge of the estate to outmaneuver the intruders. She realized that courage was not only in combat, but in strategy, quick thinking, and the willingness to act despite fear. Her bond with Kyle deepened with every passing moment, each glance and touch reinforcing the trust that had grown between them. Amid the chaos, Kyle reached the central chamber of the estate, where the heart of the curse was said to reside. The ancient runes carved into the stone walls seemed to pulse with energy, whispering of generations bound to war and suffering. He approached the blade embedded in the altar, the same weapon that had haunted his family for centuries. This is it, he said, voice low. The moment of choice. The moment to prove that I am more than the curse that has followed my bloodline. Ilara stepped beside him, her hand brushing his. You are more, Kale. I believe in you. He nodded, closing his eyes. With a steadying breath, he drew the blade from the altar. The room shivered as if responding to the release of the ancient power. Shadows writhed along the walls, and a cold wind swept through the chamber, carrying whispers of fear and doubt. Yet Kale stood firm, his resolve strengthened by Ilara's presence. To break the curse, he said, I must offer my freedom, my pride, and the ruthlessness that has defined my family. I must choose love and mercy over fear and power. The moment hung heavy, silent, and eternal. Kyle lifted the blade and with a deliberate motion plunged it into the ground. Light erupted, silver and pure, washing over the chamber. The shadows screamed and faded, and the oppressive weight that had haunted his family for centuries began to lift. Elara watched in awe as Cale's shoulders relaxed, his expression softening in a way she had never seen before. The War Duke, ruthless as a wolf, had chosen love and trust over conquest and fear. The curse was broken, yet the moment of victory did not come without risk. A final attack struck from the shadows, a rival noble attempting to seize the blade and claim power for himself. Cale moved instinctively, protecting Elara, and with a single strike, ended the threat. The danger had passed, and the estate was finally secure. They stood together, the weight of the night settling around them. Kyle turned to Elara, his dark eyes now full of warmth, relief, and a quiet vulnerability. "It is done," he said softly. "The curse, it is no more. But I could not have done it without you. Your courage, your trust, your presence, they carried me through." Elara's eyes shimmered. "And I could not have faced this without you," she replied. "You are not just a duke, Cale. You are more. A man who can change, who can love, who can choose." Cale reached for her hand, holding it gently yet firmly. "And I choose you," he said, "not because of duty, not because of power, but because of my heart. You are my hope, my anchor, my future." For the first time, the storm that had surrounded them, the danger, the whispers, the weight of legacy, felt distant. All that remained was the bond they had forged through trust, courage, and the trials of fate. The moonlight streamed through the windows, casting silver across their faces, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to their triumph. Elara stepped closer, her heart full. "Then let us leave the shadows behind," she said softly. "Let us walk into the future together, free of fear, free of curses, free to choose our path." Cale nodded, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his face. "Together," he agreed. The sun rose fully, bathing the castle in warmth and light. Birds sang in the gardens, and the people of the estate began to stir, sensing that the darkness that had threatened them for so long had finally passed. Yet the memory of trials and courage lingered, a reminder that peace is earned through bravery, trust, and love. As Cale and Elara walked through the halls hand in hand, their steps confident and unafraid, they knew that the world would never be without challenge. Shadows would always exist, and threats would arise. But they had discovered something stronger than fear, stronger than power, stronger than destiny itself, the bond between two hearts willing to trust, sacrifice, and love without reservation. The War Duke had been ruthless like a wolf, but through the courage of a noble woman and the strength of his own heart, he had found redemption. And the Earl's daughter, once promised to another, had chosen a path of freedom, love, and self-determination. The castle stood in quiet triumph, the first light of dawn promising a future not dictated by shadows or curses, but by choice, courage, and the power of the heart. And somewhere, in the distant hills, the howl of a wolf carried across the land, a symbol of strength, of loyalty, and of love that could conquer even the darkest fate. Cale and Elara paused at the highest tower, looking out over the estate and the land beyond. The wind caught their hair, the sun warmed their faces, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. "Whatever comes next," Cale said, his voice steady and strong, "we face it together. Always." Elara smiled, squeezing his hand. "Always," she echoed, and together they stepped forward into a world reborn, where shadows no longer ruled, and where love, courage, and choice defined their destiny.